Lancashire, England, 1882. The village of Ashworth lay beneath a veil of perpetual fog, its narrow cobblestone streets slick with rain that never quite seemed to stop. Chimneys from the cotton mills punctured the gray sky, exhaling columns of black smoke that merged with the clouds until it became impossible to tell where industry ended and heaven began. In the terraced houses that lined those streets, families lived close together, their lives measured out in the rhythm of factory bells and church chimes, in the careful accounting of pennies and the quiet hope that tomorrow might be gentler than today. It was a world of gaslight and coal dust, of Sunday sermons and Monday morning, where death was not a stranger but a frequent visitor who knocked on doors without warning. And it was here, in a cramped parlor on Millbrook Lane, that a photographer named Edmund Hartley set up his camera on a Tuesday afternoon in late November, preparing to capture what would become one of the most haunting images in the history of Victorian portraiture. The subject was a boy named Samuel Preston, 11 years old, with dark hair that fell across his forehead and eyes that held the solemn awareness children of that era often possessed. He sat perfectly still in a wooden chair, his hands folded in his lap, his Sunday collar pressed and clean. The room smelled of damp wool and carbolic soap. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows like a living thing. Edmund worked methodically, adjusting the exposure, measuring the light, asking the boy not to move, not even to breathe if he could help it. The camera was a mysterious device to most people then, a box of glass and brass that could steal a moment from time and fix it forever onto a silver plate. Samuel's mother stood in the corner, her fingers twisted in her apron, watching. His father had not yet returned from the mill. The shutter opened and closed with a mechanical precision that seemed almost sacred in its finality. Click. The image was captured. 20 minutes later, Samuel Preston would collapse on the stairs leading to his bedroom, blood rushing from his nose, his small body convulsing as his mother screamed for help that would arrive too late. No one in the room could have guessed they were staring at a living face already claimed by death. The Preston family lived in a modest two-up, two-down terrace house that leaned slightly to one side, as if tired from bearing witness to too many winters. Samuel was the middle child of 5, bookended by 2 older sisters, Margaret and Eleanor, and 2 younger brothers, Thomas and little William, who was still nursing. Their father, Robert Preston, worked the looms at Ashworth Mill, his hands permanently stained with machine oil and indigo dye. Their mother, Catherine, took in washing and mending to supplement the family income, her fingers raw and reddened from lye soap and endless labor. Life was not easy, but it was not unbearable either. There were moments of sweetness pressed between the hardship like wildflowers growing through cobblestones. On Sunday mornings, the children walked to chapel together, Samuel holding William's hand while Margaret carried the prayer book their grandmother had left them. At supper, they shared stories and passed around a single loaf of bread, each child taking their portion without complaint. Samuel was a thoughtful boy, quieter than his siblings, more inclined to observation than play. He liked to watch the way light moved across the kitchen table in the afternoon, the way his mother's shadow stretched across the floor when she stood at the stove. He collected things, smooth stones from the canal, bird feathers, a brass button he'd found gleaming in the mud. His teacher, Miss Hartwell, said he had a gift for memorization and could recite entire passages of scripture without hesitation. But there were signs, looking back, that something inside him was already failing. A cough that lingered through October and into November, dry and persistent. Mornings when he couldn't seem to catch his breath, when climbing the stairs left him dizzy and pale. His mother noticed the way his clothes hung looser each week, the way his collarbones began to show like fragile wings beneath his skin. She told herself it was only the change of seasons, that he needed more broth, more rest, more prayers. The word consumption was whispered but never spoken aloud, as if naming it might make it real. On the morning of the photograph, Catherine had woken early to press Samuel's Sunday shirt, running the hot iron back and forth until every wrinkle surrendered. She wanted him to look his best. The portrait had been saved for, planned for, a small extravagance justified by the knowledge that children grew so quickly, that time had a way of stealing faces from memory. She brushed his hair until it shone, straightened his collar, told him to be brave and still. Samuel had asked why they were taking the photograph now, and Catherine had smiled and said, "Because we love you, because we want to remember this moment." She did not say what she feared in her deepest heart, that this might be their only chance. The collapse came without ceremony or warning. Samuel had just returned from the photographer's studio, his mother fussing over him, asking if he was hungry, if he wanted tea. He started up the narrow staircase to his room, one hand on the banister, his footsteps slow but steady. Then, halfway up, he stopped. Catherine was in the kitchen and heard the sound of his body hitting the steps, a terrible cascading thud that made her drop the cup she was holding. She found him crumpled on the landing, his face pressed against the wall, blood streaming from his nose and mouth. His eyes rolled back until only the whites showed. She screamed for Margaret to fetch the doctor, gathered Samuel into her arms, felt the terrible heat radiating from his skin like coals beneath cloth. He was convulsing, his limbs jerking in rhythms she could not control, sounds coming from his throat that were not words, but something older and more primal, the body's last protest against its own unraveling. The doctor arrived within the hour, his bag heavy with instruments that would prove useless. He examined the boy, listened to his rattling chest, took his pulse, which was weak and irregular, a bird's heartbeat trapped in a cage of ribs. "Consumption," he said finally, his voice flat with the authority of diagnosis. "Advanced pulmonary tuberculosis." The disease had been eating through Samuel's lungs for months, perhaps longer, turning healthy tissue into something that resembled wet paper, collapsing from within. There was nothing to be done, the doctor explained, no cure, no treatment beyond rest and prayer and perhaps a spoonful of laudanum to ease the suffering. He applied leeches to Samuel's temples, believing the old remedy might draw out the fever. He left a tonic made of honey and herbs that tasted of bitter earth. He told Catherine to prepare herself, to call for the priest, to make arrangements. Samuel lingered through the night and into the next day, unconscious, his breathing shallow and labored, each exhale a small surrender. His siblings took turns sitting beside the bed, holding his hand, whispering stories of summer days and promises of spring. Robert came home from the mill with ash on his face and wept into his calloused hands. The priest arrived at dawn on the second day and administered last rites, anointing Samuel's forehead with holy oil while murmuring Latin prayers that floated through the room like smoke. At 7:30 in the morning, Samuel Preston's breathing stopped. The doctor confirmed it, placing a mirror beneath the boy's nose, finding no breath, no mist, no sign of life. The quietest moment came after, when the house fell into a stillness so complete it seemed the world itself had paused. Catherine sat beside the empty bed, holding the thin wool blanket that still held the shape of her son's body, still carried the faint warmth of him, as though he had simply stepped away for a moment and might return. The custom was well established by 1882. When a child died, especially one from a family of limited means, who had never been photographed in life, there was often a single chance to capture their image for posterity. Post-mortem photography, it was called, though few used that clinical term. To the families, it was simply the last portrait, the final remembrance, a way of holding on to a face that would otherwise be lost to time and failing memory. Edmund Hartley, the photographer who had captured Samuel's living image just 2 days before, was summoned back to the Preston house on the mornings after the boy's death. He came with his equipment and his professional discretion, having performed this service many times before. The dead, he had learned, were easier subjects than the living. They did not fidget or blink, or grow impatient with the long exposure times. They held their poses with perfect stillness. The family had prepared Samuel according to tradition. His body had been washed and dressed in his Sunday best, the same clothes he had worn for the previous photograph. His hair had been combed, his hands folded across his chest, his eyes closed as if in peaceful sleep. They had placed him in the parlor, propped slightly upright in a chair, surrounded by flowers sent by neighbors and tied with black ribbon. Candles burned on the mantelpiece, casting long shadows across the walls. The air was heavy with the scent of wax and lilies and something else beneath, something organic and inevitable that no amount of perfume could quite conceal. Edmund set up his camera in the same position as before, found the same angle, the same light. Catherine insisted on being in the photograph this time, standing behind Samuel's chair with one hand resting on his shoulder, her face drawn but composed, her eyes fixed on something beyond the camera's lens. The room fell silent except for the soft hiss of the gas lamps. Edmund counted down the seconds of exposure, but something was wrong. He noticed it immediately, though he said nothing. The boy's face had an unusual quality to it, a softness that seemed inconsistent with rigor mortis, which should have set in hours ago. The lips were not quite the pale blue he expected, but held a faint suggestion of color, as if blood still moved beneath the skin, and when he leaned closer to adjust the focus, he thought he saw, or perhaps imagined, the faintest flutter of the boy's eyelid, the smallest tremor of movement that could have been a trick of the candlelight, or could have been something else entirely. He completed the photograph without comment, packed his equipment, accepted his payment, and left the house with a disquiet he could not name. When the image was developed 3 days later, Edmund stood in his dark room and stared at the plate for a long time before delivering it to the Preston family. In the photograph, Samuel's eyes were not quite fully closed. A thin crescent of white showed beneath each lid, catching the light in a way that made it seem as if the boy was watching, waiting, suspended in that terrible space between presence and absence. They hung the photograph on the wall of the parlor, never realizing it might not have been a farewell, but a record of the moment in between. The photograph remained with the Preston family for 43 years. Catherine kept it on the mantelpiece until her own death in 1910, dusting the frame every Sunday, sometimes speaking to it as if Samuel might hear. When the house was finally sold in 1925, the contents were dispersed among descendants and auction houses, the accumulated possessions of generations scattered like seeds on the wind. The photograph ended up in a wooden box of miscellaneous Victorian memorabilia purchased by an antiquarian named Arthur Whitmore, who specialized in collecting the ephemera of ordinary lives, letters, diaries, receipts, images of people whose names had been forgotten. He found the Preston photograph tucked between a set of calling cards and a faded railway ticket. The glass cracked, but the image still clear. At first, it seemed unremarkable, another Victorian post-mortem portrait, sad but common, the kind of artifact he had seen hundreds of times before. But something about the boy's face arrested his attention. He brought it closer to the window, angled it in the light, and felt a strange discomfort settle in his chest. The eyes. Even in death, they seemed to carry awareness. He began to research. In the back of the frame, he found a small card with Samuel's name and the date, November 23, 1882. Through parish records and census documents, he traced the Preston family, found newspaper obituaries, located the death certificate, and then he found something else, a journal entry written by Dr. William Ashford, the physician who had attended Samuel in his final hours. The entry was dated November 25, 1882, 2 days after Samuel's supposed death. In it, Dr. Ashford expressed a troubling concern, a lingering doubt he had not voiced at the time. He wrote of the boy's unusual presentation, the lack of definitive signs he had been trained to recognize. He mentioned the possibility, remote but not impossible, that the child had been in a state of catalepsy, a condition that mimicked death so completely that even trained physicians could be deceived. The pulse could become undetectable, the breathing so shallow as to be imperceptible, the body cold and unresponsive. Ashford had heard of cases where patients had been declared dead, only to wake hours or even days later, some in their coffins, some already buried. He had not raised these concerns with the Preston family, he wrote, because what good would doubt do in the face of grief already absolute? But the question haunted him. Had Samuel Preston been dead when he examined him, or had the boy been locked inside a body that could no longer communicate its living state? Arthur Whitmore stood in his study holding the journal and the photograph, and felt the weight of a century-old tragedy pressing against him. They hung the photograph on the wall, never realizing it might not have been a farewell, but a record of the moment in between. The shocking suggestion took root and would not let go. Samuel Preston might have been alive when the shutter clicked. The condition Dr. Ashford feared had a name, though it was imperfectly understood even in the early 20th century. Catalepsy, or suspended animation, was a state of profound unconsciousness in which the body's vital signs slowed to such a degree that death appeared to have occurred. It could be triggered by severe illness, particularly diseases affecting the nervous system or respiratory function. Tuberculosis, in its advanced stages, could produce fever-induced states that resembled death, where the patient's metabolism slowed dramatically, their heartbeat became almost imperceptible, and their breathing so faint that even a mirror held to their lips might show no condensation. Victorian medicine, for all its confidence, had limited tools for confirming death. Physicians checked for breath, for pulse, for the clouding of a mirror, for the rigor of muscles and the cooling of skin. But these signs were not infallible. The fear of premature burial was so widespread in the 19th century that it spawned an entire industry of safety coffins equipped with bells and breathing tubes, mechanisms designed to alert the living if the supposedly dead should wake. Newspapers regularly published accounts of near misses, bodies that showed signs of life just before burial, corpses that had shifted position in their coffins, scratch marks found on the interior of coffin lids during exhumations. Some estimates suggested that as many as 1 in every 100 burials might have been premature, though the true number would never be known. Samuel Preston's case fit the pattern disturbingly well. A child weakened by tuberculosis, suffering from high fever and convulsions, examined by a country doctor with limited experience and even more limited equipment. The declaration of death made quickly, perhaps too quickly, driven by the expectation of death rather than its confirmation. The photograph taken within hours before the traditional laying out period had fully elapsed, and in that photograph the subtle signs that Edmund Hartley had noticed but dismissed. The color in the lips, the softness of the features, the eyes not quite fully closed, as if the boy was resting rather than departed. Modern forensic experts, when shown the image decades later, pointed to details that supported this terrible possibility. The position of the hands, slightly flexed rather than fully relaxed. The absence of the sunken, hollow appearance that typically develops within hours of death. The quality of the skin, which in the photograph appears to retain a subtle elasticity rather than the waxy rigidity of the truly dead. Of course, photographic technology of the era had its limitations, and interpretations varied. But the question remained, persistent and unanswerable. Had Samuel Preston been alive when his post-mortem portrait was taken, trapped in a body that gave every appearance of death, aware on some deep neurological level of his family gathered around him, of the camera's lens fixed upon him, of the terrible mistake being made, even science, with all its instruments and retrospective analysis, could not strip the dread from that possibility. To understand the full weight of the Preston tragedy, one must return to the people who lived it, to the family who stood in that parlor, believing they were bidding farewell to a child already gone. Catherine Preston's diary, discovered among A. Arthur Whitmore's collection, provides a window into those days. Her handwriting is careful, educated beyond what one might expect from a millworker's wife, the letters formed with precision as if each word was a small act of survival. The entry for November 23, 1882, the day of Samuel's death, is brief. He is gone. The house is so quiet. But the entries that follow tell a different story, a mother's slow unraveling. November 25th. The photograph was taken today. I stood behind him with my hand on his shoulder, and I swear I felt warmth there still, as if he was only sleeping. Edmund, the photographer, seemed troubled, but said nothing. I wanted to ask him to wait, to take the picture tomorrow instead, but I could not say why. Perhaps I am going mad with grief. November 27th. They buried my boy this afternoon. The Reverend spoke of God's mercy and heaven's peace, but I felt no peace. I felt only the terrible certainty that I had failed him somehow, that there was something I should have seen or done or understood. Robert tells me this is grief speaking, that I must let Samuel rest. But I cannot. The diary continues for months, years, Catherine returning again and again to the photograph, to the feeling that something had been missed, something essential. She describes dreams in which Samuel is calling to her from a great distance, his voice muffled as if through earth or water. She writes of the unbearable thought that haunts her wakeful hours. What if he was still with us when we dressed him for burial? What if he could hear us crying and could not respond? What if we sealed him in darkness while some part of him still lived? These are not the rational questions of an investigator, but the tormented wonderings of a mother who has lost the most precious thing and cannot find her way back to any sense of order or justice. Robert Preston's letters written to his brother in Manchester are more restrained but no less haunted. In one, dated December 1882, he writes, Catherine is not herself. She insists that Samuel was not truly gone when they took his portrait. I do not know how to comfort her. I, too, have my doubts, but I bury them as I buried my son, because what is the alternative? To dig him up? To confirm or deny what cannot be changed? Better to let him rest and pray that God was more merciful than we deserve. The theme emerges clearly from these private documents. Guilt, the most corrosive of emotions, the sense of having acted too quickly or not quickly enough, of having trusted the wrong authorities, of having failed in the most fundamental parental duty to protect one's child from harm, and threading through it all, the question that would not let them rest. Did Samuel feel abandoned in his final moments, left alone in the space between life and death, while his family mourned a loss that had not yet fully occurred? Perhaps Samuel Preston never truly died in 1882, in the way his family believed. Perhaps he lingered in some twilight state, aware of their presence, feeling his mother's hand on his shoulder, seeing the flash of light as the photographer's shutter opened and closed. Perhaps the photograph captured not a corpse, but a boy suspended in the last moments of consciousness, unable to signal his presence, unable to call them back. Or perhaps he was already gone, and the signs his family and the photographer saw were nothing more than the tricks grief plays on the seeing eye, the desperate human need to believe that death is not final, that those we love remain with us somehow, just beyond reach. The Preston photograph became, in the years following Arthur Whitmore's research, something of a fascination for historians and collectors of Victorian ephemera. It appeared in exhibitions on 19th-century mourning practices, in academic papers discussing the ethics and methods of post-mortem photography, in popular articles about Victorian attitudes toward death. The image itself is stark and formal, as was the style of the era. Samuel sits upright, his small body dressed in dark wool, his face pale against the darker tones of the room. Catherine stands behind him, her expression unreadable, her hand resting on his shoulder in a gesture that could be read as protective or possessive or simply heartbroken. The photograph is both intimate and distant, a private moment made public, a family's grief transformed into a historical artifact. Modern viewers respond to it with a mixture of fascination and discomfort. Some see only the sadness of a child's death, the universal tragedy of a life cut short. Others, knowing the story behind the image, see something more unsettling, the possibility that the photograph captures not death but its imitation, that Samuel's closed eyes might have opened again if given time, that the stillness in the frame is not the stillness of the grave, but the stillness of a body conserving its last reserves of life. Forensic experts and medical historians continue to debate the evidence. Some argue that the photographic details Arthur Whitmore identified are inconclusive, that Victorian photography techniques often produced anomalies that can be misinterpreted. Others point to the documented prevalence of catalepsy and premature burial in the 19th century and suggest that Samuel's case, while tragic, was likely not unique. There are records of similar incidents, cases where supposed corpses showed signs of life just before burial, where families delayed funerals based on intuition or superstition and were proven right when the deceased stirred and woke. But for every confirmed case, there are dozens, perhaps hundreds, that were never discovered, buried quite literally in the graves of the past. The Preston photograph endures not because it provides answers, but because it asks questions that resist resolution. It forces us to confront the limits of human knowledge, the terrifying proximity of life and death, the ways in which our certainties can fail us at the moment we most need them. It reminds us that medicine, for all its progress, was once a discipline of guesses and traditions, that the declaration of death was as much a social ritual as a scientific determination, and that families like the Prestons had to make impossible decisions based on imperfect information and the desperate need to believe they were doing right by their children. And so we return to the image itself, that haunting photograph taken in a fog-veiled village in Lancashire in November of 1882. We return to Samuel Preston, 11 years old, his face smooth and young, his body arranged with care, his family gathered around him in grief. We return to the question that Arthur Whitmore's research raised and could never definitively answer. Was this truly a post-mortem portrait, or something more ambiguous and more terrible? The photograph hangs now in a private collection, a piece of history preserved behind glass, viewed by scholars and curious visitors who stand before it and feel the weight of unknowing. Some claim they can see awareness in Samuel's face, that the slight parting of his lips or the shadows around his eyes suggest consciousness rather than its absence. Others see only what they expect to see: a dead child, a grieving mother, a moment of Victorian mourning captured for posterity. The truth, whatever it may be, is lost to time. Samuel Preston was buried in the churchyard of St. Michael and All Angels on November 27, 1882. His grave is marked with a simple stone that bears his name and dates and the inscription, "Beloved son, rest in peace." There is no record of his burial being disturbed. No evidence that the fears his mother expressed in her diary were ever acted upon. If Samuel was alive when they laid him in the earth, if some spark of consciousness remained, then he took that final awareness with him into silence, and no amount of historical investigation can retrieve it. What remains is the photograph, and the questions it raises about the nature of mortality, the reliability of perception, and the burden of decisions made in grief and haste. The Victorian era was obsessed with death in ways we struggle to comprehend, their mourning practices elaborate and their relationship with the dead intimate and unflinching. They photographed their deceased, wore jewelry made from the hair of the departed, held seances in parlors lit by gaslight, believing that the boundary between life and death was thinner than we now imagine it to be. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps death is not the clean divide we prefer to think, but something more gradual, more uncertain, a process rather than a moment, a fading rather than a cessation. Perhaps Samuel Preston taught us this, unwillingly, his image preserved at the exact threshold where life surrenders to its opposite, where breath becomes stillness and warmth becomes cold. His photograph does not provide closure or comfort. It offers instead a reminder of how fragile our hold on life truly is, how easily it can slip away, how much we depend on the judgment of others to tell us when a person has crossed from presence to absence. It speaks to the limits of Victorian medicine and the enduring human fear that we might make mistakes that cannot be unmade, that in our certainty we might miss the signs of life, persisting against all expectation. Perhaps Samuel Preston never truly died in 1882, for in the instant the shutter fell, he was caught forever, suspended between breath and silence, neither fully present nor fully absent, existing in that photograph is a question that echoes across the decades. His eyes, not quite closed, seem to watch from beyond the frame, challenging us to look closely, to question what we think we know, to remember that every photograph is a kind of ghost, a captured moment that holds something of the living, even as it marks their passing. We will never know with certainty whether Samuel was alive or dead when Edmund Hartley's camera fixed his image onto that silver plate. We will never know if Catherine Preston's hand, resting on her son's shoulder, touched warmth or coldness, life or its absence. What we know is this, that a boy once lived in Lancashire, loved by his family, taken too soon by illness or by error, and that his face looks out at us still from a photograph taken 143 years ago, asking us to see him, to remember him, to wonder what he felt in those final ambiguous moments when the world was deciding whether to let him go or hold on just a little longer. In the end, perhaps that is the legacy of Samuel Preston, not an answer, but a question that we carry forward, a reminder that life and death are not always as distinct as we need them to be, that the space between them is narrow and uncertain, and that we walk that edge ourselves every day, trusting in the steadiness of our own hearts, hoping that when our time comes, someone will know the difference, will see us clearly, will not let go too soon.